What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. As well as our second channel sponsor, the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. If you're ever in town, be sure to stop in and say hi to Martin. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you another fun game filmed down at the Hobby Horse with a very interesting finish. This week's matchup features Patrick playing Fogg's Ravenous Rhino deck being led by Ghired Conclave Exile, Martin playing his Griffin Tribal deck with Zeriam Golden Wing, Foggirl playing his Temur commander Yasova Dragonclaw, and Foil playing the gift-giving Blim Comedic Genius. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Patrick plays a mountain. Martin plays a plains and then passes to Fogg, who plays a mountain of his own. Foil plays a tapped Temple of Malice, scrying one card, keeping it on top of his library. Patrick plays a plains for turn. Martin also plays a plains for turn and passes the turn to Fogg, who plays an island. Foil plays an exotic orchard, then pays 1 for turn 2 Soul Ring, before paying an additional 2 for a Whispersilk Cloak. Patrick plays his second plains, then pays 2 for a determined iteration. Martin plays another plains for turn, then gets the Griffin train rolling, casting a Wild Griffin. Fogg plays his second island for turn, then pays 3 to cast a Morph. Foil plays a swamp for turn, then has enough mana to pay in order to cast his commander Blim. Patrick draws and misses a land drop before passing his turn to Martin, who draws for turn. Martin plays a plains for turn, then pays 4 to cast his commander Zeriam. He then goes to combat swinging his Griffin at Fogg for 2 damage, which then triggers his commander, creating him a Griffin token. Fogg casts a Frantic Search, which has him drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and untapping 3 lands. He then pays 3 to cast a second Morph and passes. Foil plays a Rogue's Passage for turn and then pays 2 in order to equip his commander with his cloak. He then pays to cast a Jinxed Idol and then goes to combat swinging his commander at Martin for 4 damage. With his commander connecting, he then gives Martin the Jinxed Idol, which has him losing an additional life and discarding a card from his hand. Patrick draws and then misses another land drop before passing his turn to Martin, who loses 2 life on his upkeep. Martin then untaps and draws for turn before playing another plains. He then pays 3 and casts a Sparring Regiment. He then chooses to learn by discarding a card in order to draw a card. Martin then goes to combat swinging out with all of his Griffins at Foil, which then untaps his commander and adds an additional counter to him. With all of his Griffins then dealing damage, Martin creates 3 more Griffin tokens. Martin then casts a Pro Medallion and passes his turn. Fogg plays a Zoetic Caverns for turn before paying 3 in order to morph over his Jeering Instigator. He then uses his ability to steal Martin's commander before then going to combat, swinging Zeriam back at Martin. Martin then chump blocks with one of his Griffins, but before damage is dealt, he sacrifices it in order to give Patrick the Jinxed Idol. Foil plays a Fabled Passage for turn and then casts a Plague Reaver. He then goes to combat, once again swinging his commander at Martin, and with his commander connecting, he then gives Martin a Plague Reaver, who loses a life and discards a card. Foil then cracks his Fabled Passage to go get a Swamp, before he then pays 4 and casts a Coffner's Plans. Then, with the enchantment entering play, he exiles the top 7 cards of his library. Patrick loses 2 life on his upkeep before he then draws for turn. He then pays to cast a Generous Gift, destroying Martin's Pro Medallion, giving him a 3/3 Dice Elephant. Martin draws and then once again goes to combat, swinging all out at Foil, which untaps his commander and gives him a counter, taking Foil down to 10 life. He then creates a bunch more Griffin tokens before casting an Assault Griffin and a Swords of Plowshares to exile the Plague Reaver before his board gets wiped. Martin then gains some life and passes his turn to Fogg, who just draws and passes. Foil plays a Swamp from his exile pile before then paying 3 to cast a Demonic Lure, drawing 3 cards. He then goes to combat, this time swinging out at Patrick, who takes the damage, and he gives him a Demonic Lure, which has him losing 2 more life and discarding 2 cards. Foil then casts the Last One Standing, and Martin rolls a dice to see which creature is going to survive. The Jeering Instigator is in the Lucky Survivor and the rest of the board gets wiped. Foil then casts a Curse of Opulence, enchanting Fogg and passes. Patrick loses 2 life on his upkeep and then draws for turn. He then pays to cast an Arcane Signet and then the Sakura Tri-Builder he's had in his hand since the beginning of the game. Martin draws and then pays to recast his commander a second time. Fogg draws for turn and then casts an Is It Charm, which has him choosing to draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. He finally gets the force that he needs and plays it as his land for turn. Foil plays a mountain for turn and then pays to recast his commander a second time before he then pays to equip it with the Whispersilk Cloak. Before his upkeep, Patrick sacks Steve in order to give Martin back the Jinxed idol. He then plays a Cabaret Courtyard, which has him searching his library for a tapped forest while he also gains a life. He then casts a Kadama's Reach in order to get a second forest to put into play and a land for his hand. On his upkeep, Martin loses 2 life before he then draws Return. Martin then goes to combat and this time swings at Patrick with his commander, which has his commander untapping and getting a +1/+1 counter. He then casts a Goldmane Griffin and passes his turn to Fog before he remembers he should have another Griffin token. Fog draws Return and then finally has enough mana to cast his commander, Yasova Dragonclaw. Foil plays a Swamp Return and then pays 4 black mana to cast a Nefarious Lich. He then goes to combat, once again attacking Martin. Once damage is dealt, he gives Martin the Nefarious Lich. Patrick draws and plays a Mountain for turn before he then pays 2 for a Valorous Stance in order to destroy Martin's commander. And in response, Martin sacks him in order to give him back the Jinxed idol. Patrick then casts a Contraband Livestock in order to exile Martin's Griffin before he then rolls a dice, giving him a 4/4 Ox token. He then finally casts a Chance for Glory, which has him untapping all of his permanents and taking an extra turn. Patrick then loses 2 life on his second upkeep and draws Return. He then casts Your Temple is under attack and chooses for himself and Foil to both draw 2 cards. Patrick then also casts Cut a Deal, which has each of his opponents drawing a card while he draws 3 more cards. He then has nothing else to play and goes out like a champ, losing the game. This then gives Foil back all of his permanents and Martin draws Return. Martin then goes to combat and unprovoked attacks Fog with both of his creatures, and in response, Fog casts Force Away in order to bounce his Griffin back to his hand. This then is Fog drawing a card and discarding a card off the Ferocious trigger. He then chump blocks the Ox with his Jeering Instigator, and in his second main phase, Martin casts a Griffin Dreamfinder. He then also casts an Ossification, which has him enchanting one of his lands and exiling Fog's commander. Fog plays his second Mountain for turn before paying 1 in order to cast his favorite card, Soothsaying, and then another 4 to cast a Rekindling Phoenix. Foil loses 2 life on his upkeep to his own Jinxed idol before he then plays a tapped Rakdos Guildgate. He then casts a Harmless Offering in order to give Fog the Demonic Lore. Foil then swings his commander at Fog, dealing damage and giving him the Coffiner's Plans, which has him losing 2 more life and discarding 2 cards. In his second main phase, he pays to cast a Crown of Doom and then pay an additional 2 to gift the crown to Martin. Martin draws for turn and then pays to cast an Inspiring Roar, which puts a 1/1 counter to each of his creatures. He then goes to combat, swinging both of his creatures at Fog while he untaps one, adding an additional 1/1 counter. Fog doesn't block and then takes the damage. In his second main phase, Martin then casts a Griffin Rider and passes turn. Fog untaps Return and then pays 2 in order to cast a Foundation Breaker to destroy the Coffiner's Plans. He then loses life to the Demonic Lore and passes. On his upkeep, Foil loses 2 life before he then draws Return and casts Read the Bones. This then has him scrying 2 cards to the bottom of his library before he then draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Foil then casts a Sign in Blood, losing 2 more life and drawing 2 more cards. He then casts a Bizarre Trader and passes turn. Martin draws Return and then pays 2 to give the crown to Fog. He then goes to combat and swings all out at Fog, taking him down to 1 life. Second main phase, he casts a Courier Griffin but doesn't gain 2 life when he enters play. Martin then casts an Arcane Signet, and on his end step, Fog pays 4 into his Soothsaying. He looks at the top 4 cards of his library and puts them back in any order. Fog then draws and plays a Bonder's Enclave for turn before he pays 4 in order to enchant his Phoenix with a Draceumbra. Fog then goes to combat and swings his Phoenix at Foil, who's forced to block with his commander, but before damage is dealt, he sacks his commander in order to give Martin the Jinxed idol. Foil draws for turn and then pays to cast his commander a 3rd time, before he then pays once again to equip him with the Whispersoul Cloak. On his upkeep, Martin draws for turn and exiles 2 cards from his graveyard, before also paying to recast his commander a 3rd time. Martin then goes to combat, swinging creatures of both Fog and Foil in order to try to win the game. In response, Foil casts a Chaos Warp targeting the Nefarious Lich, and in an hysterical turn of events has him shuffling the Lich into his own library and Martin losing the game. Fog draws for turn and then pays to cast an Elysian Caryatid. On his upkeep, Foil sacks his commander in order to give Fog the Jinxed idol in order to not die on his upkeep. Fog then sacks his character to give the idol back to Foil. Foil then uses his traitor in order to give the idol back to Fog, who then sacks his Phoenix in order to give the idol back to Foil. Foil then goes to sack his traitor, but then realizes with Fog having one more creature to sack, he's going to end up losing the game to his idol on his upkeep anyways. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.